The memorial of Sol floated in the cold darkness where Earth had once been a living world. And Kethmora stood before the great viewing window with her 4 arms crossed behind her back as she watched the dead planet turn. Slowly in the void she was old for a Veluxi. Her scales faded from bright emerald to a dusty sage. But her mind remained sharp, and her voice, still, carried the weight of authority that came from spending 3 centuries studying the most important species the galaxy had ever known. They called themselves humans, she said to the young diplomats gathered behind her, their various forms shifting nervously as they listened to the ancient history. And they were the ones who united us all when we were nothing but scattered tribes fighting over scraps of the cosmos. A young Lithori raised one crystalline appendage and asked what humans looked like. And Kethmora turned to face the group with something like sorrow in her large golden eyes. They were soft creatures, she explained, with no natural armor and no claws and no venom. And yet they became the most feared warriors the galaxy has ever seen because they simply refused to accept defeat as a possibility. She gestured toward the holographic display that hummed to life in the center of the observation deck, showing images recovered from ancient databases that were now considered sacred texts by every species in the Liva. Concord, the humans in the images, were strange beings with only 2 arms and 2 legs, their skin coming in various shades of brown and pink and tan, their faces capable of expressing emotions that other species found almost uncomfortably intense. 2,300 years ago, Kethmora continued, a rift opened in the fabric of space itself, and from that wound in reality came the devouring swarm. The young diplomat shuddered at the name. For even after all these centuries, the swarm remained the monster that parents used to frighten children into obedience across 1,000 worlds. The swarm consumed everything, Kethmora said, planets and moons and stars themselves. And the 12 species that would become the Galactic Concord were helpless against them because we had never faced anything like this horror before. She paused and looked back at the ruined Earth, its oceans long since boiled away, and its continents scarred by ancient weapons fire that had burned hot enough to melt mountains. But the humans had faced horror before, she said softly, because their own history was filled with war and suffering and loss. And they had learned something that we peaceful species had never understood. The young Lithori asked what the humans had learned, and Kethmora smiled a sad smile that showed her pointed teeth. They learned that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to become the thing that monsters fear, she answered. And so they did exactly that. The holographic display shifted to show ancient battle recordings, grainy and damaged by time, but still clear enough to see human warships engaging the swarm in desperate combat, while civilian evacuation fleets fled behind them. They held the line for 17 years. Kethmora said, buying time for the rest of us to escape to the far reaches of the galaxy while they fought and bled, and died in numbers that still make our historians weep. She explained how the humans had developed a weapon that could seal the rift. But the cost was terrible, beyond imagination, because it required sacrificing their entire homeworld and every ship in their remaining fleet. They did not hesitate, Kethmora said, not for a single moment. And when the other species begged them to find another way, they simply smiled and said that protecting others was what humans did. The final transmission from the human fleet had been preserved in every archive across the Concord, and Kethmora played it now for the young diplomats who listened in reverent silence. A human face appeared on the display, a woman with dark skin and gray hair and eyes that held no fear even as alarms blared in the background of her burning ship. "Run," the woman said in a voice that was calm and steady and filled with absolute certainty. "Live and remember us and build something beautiful with the time we are giving you." The transmission ended with static, and the young diplomats stood in silence for a long moment before one of them asked if any humans had Survived Kithmora shook her head slowly and explained that every search had found nothing but debris and graves. And after 3 centuries of looking, the Concord had finally accepted that humanity was truly gone. We built this memorial to honor them, she said. And we named our alliance the Galactic Concord because that was the word they used for peace and agreement. And we swore that we would never forget what they sacrificed for us. She was about to continue when an alarm suddenly screamed through the station and red lights began flashing in every corridor as panicked voices flooded the communication channels. Kithmora rushed to the nearest terminal and felt her blood turn to ice as she read the emergency reports flooding in from the outer reaches of known space. A new rift had opened at the edge of the galaxy, and from that wound in reality the devouring swarm was pouring through in numbers that made the ancient invasion look like a minor skirmish. No, she whispered, as she watched the tactical displays fill with red markers that represented enemy forces beyond counting. This cannot be happening, but it was happening. And across the Concord, panic spread like wildfire as species that had known nothing but peace for over 2,000 years suddenly faced the return of their oldest. Nightmare emergency transmissions flooded every network as colony worlds screamed for help, and defense fleets scrambled to respond to threats they were never designed to face. The Concord had grown soft in its long peace, Kithmora realized with growing horror, and their peacetime military was a shadow of what it had been. During the first swarm war, she looked back at the dead Earth one final time and felt tears forming in her eyes as she understood that without the humans, there was no one left who could save them. We needed more time, she said to no one in particular. We needed you to teach us how to fight like you did. But the humans were gone, and the swarm was returning, and the galaxy that they had died to protect was about to burn unless something changed very soon. Kithmora knew that everything humanity had sacrificed would have been for nothing, and that thought hurt more than anything she had ever experienced in her long and peaceful life. The Great Council Chamber of the Sar Prime had not seen such chaos in over 1,000 years, and High Chancellor Vreth-San watched the assembled representatives argue and shout and weep with a heavy heart beating somewhere inside. His crystalline body, he was ancient even by Lithori standards, his form grown large and complex over centuries of careful mineral absorption, and the light that pulsed through his translucent structure flickered with colors that expressed his deep concern. Order, he called out in a voice that resonated through the chamber like a great bell being struck. We must have order if we are to find a way through this darkness. The representatives slowly fell silent and turned their varied faces toward the High Chancellor as he rose to his full height of nearly 4 meters. The military projections have been completed, Vreth-San announced, and I will not soften their meaning with gentle words because you all deserve to know the truth of what we face. He activated the central display, and the chamber filled with tactical data that made several of the younger representatives cry out in despair. The swarm will reach the core worlds within 3 standard years, Vreth-San said, and our combined fleets may slow their advance, but they cannot stop it, because we simply do not have the ships or the weapons or the training to fight this enemy. The Luxy Admiral stood and demanded to know what options remained. And the High Chancellor turned his glowing eyes toward her with something like pity. We have one option, he said, and it is one that many of you will consider foolish or desperate or both. He gestured, and the display shifted to show an image that every being in the chamber recognized immediately. It was the symbol of humanity, a simple blue circle containing a white star. And seeing it projected in this place of power sent murmurs rippling through the assembled representatives. The Prometheus Archives, Vreth-San said. were humanity's final gift to us before they sacrificed themselves to seal the first rift. He explained that the archives contained fragments of human military doctrine and ship designs and weapons technology. But they also contained something else that scholars had debated for centuries without reaching any conclusion. There is a message, the High Chancellor said, recorded by the last human admiral before the final battle. And for over 2,000 years, we have dismissed it as poetry or metaphor because we did not understand what it meant. He played the recording, and the chamber fell absolutely silent as a human voice filled the air with words that suddenly seemed far more significant than anyone had ever believed. When the stars grow dark again, the human said, "Look to the void between galaxies where nothing should live and where no light reaches. And call to us there, because we will hear you, and we will answer." A young Nasari diplomat raised her tentacles and asked what the message could possibly mean. Because nothing could survive in the intergalactic void where there were no stars and no planets and no resources of any kind. We always assumed it meant nothing, Rethsan admitted. But we also found something else in the archives that we never understood until this very moment. He revealed that buried deep within the Memorial of Soul, there was a device of human construction that no Concord scientist had ever been able to activate or even properly analyze. It is a beacon, the High Chancellor said, designed to send a signal not through normal space, but through something the humans called quantum foam. And it was built to reach the void between our galaxy and the nearest neighbor. The chamber erupted in confused discussion as the representatives tried to understand what any of this could mean. Admiral Yethkai of the Veluxi stood and demanded silence with a sharp gesture of her clawed hands. "Are you suggesting," she asked the High Chancellor, "that some humans may have survived and that they have been hiding in the intergalactic void for over 2,000 years?" Rethsan admitted that it sounded impossible, but reminded everyone that humans had specialized in doing impossible things throughout their entire history with the Concord. "We have no other options," he said simply. "And if there is even the smallest chance that this beacon can summon help, then we must try it because the alternative is extinction." The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. And within hours a team of the Concord's best engineers was dispatched to the Memorial of Soul to attempt activation of the ancient human. Diviseketh Mora was part of that team because she was the foremost expert on human history and culture, and she stood in the deepest chamber of the memorial watching the engineers work on a machine that hummed with power sources. They could not identify. "It is ready," the lead engineer announced after 3 days of careful preparation. "But we have no idea what will happen when we activate it." Keth Mara stepped forward and placed her scaled hand on the cold metal surface of the beacon and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. "If you can hear us," she said softly, "we need you now more than ever before." The beacon activated with a sound like reality itself being torn open, and a pulse of energy shot outward through dimensions that Concord science could not even name. Then there was silence. Days passed and nothing happened, and hope began to fade as the swarm continued its relentless advance toward the heart of civilized space. Weeks became months, and still the void remained silent, and many in the Concord began to accept that the beacon had been nothing but a final, desperate gesture from a dying species. But Keth Mora refused to give up hope because she had spent her entire life studying humans, and she knew one thing about them with absolute certainty. They kept their promises, and then one day the silence was broken. Signals began appearing on every long-range sensor in the Concord. Thousands of them at first, and then millions, all coming from the impossible emptiness between galaxies. A voice spoke across every communication channel in perfect ancient galactic common, and Keth Mara wept when she heard it, because she recognized the accent from recordings that were older than most civilizations. "We heard you," the voice said with a warmth that crossed the vast distances of space. "And we are coming home." Admiral HFY stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched another wave of her ships die in fire and silence as the swarm pressed forward with endless hunger. 8 months of fighting had reduced her fleet to less than half its original strength, and the crews that remained were exhausted and terrified and running low on everything from ammunition to hope. "Admiral," her communications officer called out with barely controlled panic in his voice, "we have lost contact with the third defensive line." HFY closed her large golden eyes and allowed herself one moment of despair before forcing her mind back to the cold calculations of warfare. "Pull back to the fourth line," she ordered, "and tell all ships to conserve ammunition because we cannot afford to waste a single shot." She had been fighting this hopeless battle since the swarm first emerged from the new rift, and every day brought news of more worlds consumed and more fleets destroyed and more species pushed toward extinction. The Concorde's peacetime military had never been designed to fight a war of this magnitude, and HFY knew in her heart that they were simply delaying the inevitable. Her sensors officer suddenly made a sound that HFY had never heard before, something between a gasp and a prayer, and she turned to see what had caused such a reaction. "Admiral," the officer said with a trembling voice, "there is something happening in Sector 7, but I do not understand what I am seeing." HFY looked at the tactical display and felt her own breath catch in her throat as she watched reality itself begin to fold and twist in ways that defied everything she knew about physics. "That is not hyperspace," she said slowly, "and it is not any form of faster than light travel that I recognize." The distortion grew larger and larger until it filled an area of space the size of a small moon. And then ships began emerging from within it. They were massive vessels of angular design with hulls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And they bristled with weapon systems that made Concorde technology look primitive by comparison. "How many?" HFY asked in a whisper that she could barely hear herself. 12,000 capital ships," her sensors officer answered with awe in his voice. "And millions of smaller craft, and Admiral, they are broadcasting on all frequencies." The communication screens flickered and then a face appeared that made HFY's heart stop beating. For a long moment it was a human face. The woman on the screen appeared young, but her eyes held a depth that spoke of ages beyond counting. And when she smiled, it was the smile of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. "Concorde forces," the woman said in a voice that carried across every ship in the fleet. "This is Admiral Yuki Tanaka-chan of the Terran Remnant." HFY could hear her crew making sounds of shock and disbelief, and something that might have been joy as the impossible truth settled into their minds. "You held the line," Admiral Tanaka-chan continued, "and you kept our memory alive for over 2,000 years. And we can never repay that debt, but we intend to spend the rest of eternity trying." She paused, and her smile grew wider, and there was something almost predatory in her expression now. "Stand aside, and let us show you what humanity has become." The human fleet moved forward with a grace that should have been impossible for ships of such enormous size. And HFY watched in stunned silence as they passed her battered defensive line and headed directly toward the swarm. "All ships hold position," she ordered, "and watch carefully, because I do not think we will ever see anything like this again." The first human weapons fired, and HFY had to shield her eyes from the brightness of the display as concentrated gravity tore through. Swarm vessels like they were made of paper dog energy weapons followed, erasing entire sections of the enemy fleet from existence without leaving even debris behind. And the swarm that had seemed so unstoppable suddenly looked very small and very fragile. "They are not even slowing down," her tactical officer reported with wonder in his voice. They are cutting through the swarm like it is nothing. Admiral Tanaka-chan appeared on the screen again, and this time her expression was more serious. Admiral Yethkai, she said, I need you to pull your fleet back to the secondary position and begin evacuation of any remaining civilian populations in this sector. Yethkai asked why evacuation was necessary if the humans were winning so decisively, because this is only the vanguard. Tanaka-chan explained, and the true swarm fleet is still coming with the queen herself at its head. She paused and something dark passed across her ancient young face. The queen remembers us, she said, and she has spent 2,300 years evolving specifically to destroy humanity because we are the only enemy that ever truly hurt her. Yethkai felt a chill run through her body as she understood what the human admiral was saying. She is coming for you. Yeth, Kai said. Yes, Tanaka-chan confirmed with a nod. And when she arrives, this war will truly begin. She smiled again, and this time there was no warmth in it at all. We have been waiting for her, the human admiral said, and we have prepared a welcome that she will never forget. The communication ended and Yethkai immediately began issuing orders for retreat and evacuation as she watched the human fleet continue its devastating advance. She had studied the legends of humanity her entire life, and she had always wondered if the stories were exaggerated. Now she knew that the stories had not come close to capturing the truth. Humans had returned and they had brought death itself with them, and the swarm queen was about to learn that some prey should never be hunted. Kethmora stepped aboard the Terran flagship, Prometheus Unbound, and felt the weight of history pressing down on her old scales as she walked through corridors that hummed with power beyond her comprehension. She had been invited as a cultural liaison between the Concord and the returned humans, and every step she took brought new wonders and new questions that her scholarly mind desperately wanted to explore. The humans who passed her in the corridors were strange and familiar at the same time, their bodies clearly modified by technologies that the Concord had never imagined possible. Some had skin that shimmered with metallic undertones and eyes that glowed with soft internal light, while others moved with a fluid grace that suggested their bones and muscles had been rebuilt for efficiency and strength. But when they smiled at her and welcomed her aboard, she could see the same warmth and curiosity that the ancient records had described. And she knew that despite all the changes, these were still the same species that had died to protect her ancestors. Admiral Tanaka-chan met her personally in a observation lounge that looked out over the vast human fleet as it prepared for the coming battle. Historian Kethmora, the admiral, said with genuine warmth in her voice, I have read your work on human culture, and I wanted to thank you for keeping our memory alive so faithfully. Kethmora found herself struggling to respond because standing before a living human after spending her entire life studying their dead civilization was almost more than her old heart could handle. I have so many questions, she finally managed to say, and I do not know where to begin. Tanaka-chan laughed, and it was a sound full of genuine humor and ancient sorrow mixed together in ways that made Kethmora want to weep. I have time, the admiral said, and I think you deserve to know the truth about what happened to us. She explained that the original plan had been to seal the rift and die with their homeworld. But a small group of human scientists had proposed an alternative that was considered madness by everyone who heard it. They wanted to chase the swarm into the void, Tanaka-chan said, to follow them between galaxies and hunt them down before they could recover and return. The plan required sacrificing everything that made normal life possible, because the intergalactic void had no stars for fuel and no planets for resources and no light to break the endless darkness. But we were humans, the admiral said with a small smile. And we had never let impossible odds stop us before. 10% of the remaining human population volunteered to crew the Void Fleet, knowing that they would never see their home galaxy again, and that they would spend the rest of their lives in darkness, hunting an enemy that wanted nothing more than to consume them. We adapted, Tanaka-chan explained, and we evolved ourselves to survive in conditions that should have killed us. And we built technologies that harvested dark matter and dark energy because those were the only resources available in the void. She told Kethmora about the generations of humans who were born and lived and died in the empty spaces between galaxies, never seeing a natural star or breathing air that did not come from recycling systems. We became something new, the Admiral admitted. Something that would have frightened our ancestors, but something that could do what needed to be done. The humans had hunted the swarm across millions of light years, destroying hive ships and killing queens, and preventing the enemy from ever rebuilding their strength. For 2,300 years we fought in the darkness, Tanaka-chan said. And every generation taught the next that our purpose was to protect the galaxy we had left behind. Kethmora asked how they had maintained that dedication across so many centuries, and the Admiral's expression grew soft with emotion. Because we remembered you, she said simply, all of you. And we knew that if we failed, then everything our ancestors died for would have been meaningless. She explained that human children grew up learning the names and histories of every Concord species, studying their cultures and their achievements and their struggles. You were our reason for existing, Tanaka-chan said. And when the beacon finally called to us, we wept with joy because it meant we could finally come home. Kethmora felt tears streaming down her scaled face as she listened to the human admiral describe millennia of sacrifice and dedication that defied everything she thought she understood about mortal beings. You made us into gods in your stories, Tanaka-chan said. But we were never gods, because gods do not know what it means to lose everything and keep fighting anyway. She stood and walked to the observation window where the human fleet spread out across the stars, like a constellation of purpose and determination. We are just humans, she said, stubborn and foolish and incapable of accepting defeat. And we made a promise to protect you, and we intend to keep it no matter what it costs us. An alarm suddenly sounded through the ship, and Tanaka-chan's expression shifted from warmth to cold calculation. In the space of a heartbeat, the Queen has arrived, she announced as tactical displays flickered to life, showing an enemy fleet that seemed to stretch across the entire horizon of space. And she has brought everything she has because she knows this is the final battle. Kethmora looked at the impossible numbers and felt despair beginning to take root in her heart. How? Can you fight that? She asked in a whisper. Admiral. Tanaka-chan turned to face her and smiled a smile that held no fear whatsoever. We have been preparing for this moment for over 2,000 years, she said. And we finally get to show the Queen what happens when you make humanity angry. She received a datapad from one of her officers and studied it briefly before laughing softly. She outnumbers us 10-1. Tanaka-chan said, which means this is finally a fair fight. The battle for the future of the galaxy began in the space between 3 star systems. And Kethmora watched from the observation deck of the Prometheus Unbound as fire bloomed across the darkness like flowers of destruction. The swarm came in waves that seemed to have no end. Billions of creatures and ships pouring forward with the mindless hunger that had haunted the galaxy's nightmares for millennia, but the human fleet met them without flinching. And weapons that bent gravity and erased matter tore through the enemy with a fury that made the ancient legends seem like understatement. Hold the line at Sector 7. Admiral Tanaka-chan commanded from her position on the bridge. And redirect the 3rd battle group to support the Concord forces on our left flank. The Concord ships had refused to retreat, despite being outmatched by the human technology. and their crews fought with a desperate courage, inspired by the return of their legendary protectors, species that had not known war for centuries, rediscovered their ancient warrior traditions. And even the peaceful Desari sent ships into battle with crews who had never fired a weapon in anger before this day. They are fighting for their homes, Tanaka-chan observed with something like pride in her voice. And that makes them more dangerous than they know. The battle raged for hours and then days as the swarm adapted to human weapons and the humans adapted in turn with modifications that their engineers designed and implemented in real time. Kethmora had never imagined that war could be fought at such a pace, with entire strategies being developed and discarded within minutes as conditions changed faster than any normal mind could process. But the human commanders were not normal. Their enhanced minds capable of processing information at speeds that made Concord tacticians look like children playing games. "The Queen is pushing toward the center," a tactical officer reported, "and she is throwing everything she has at our main line because she knows we cannot hold forever." Tanaka-chan nodded slowly, and her expression grew heavy with a weight that Kethmora recognized as the burden of a decision that had been made long ago. "It is time," the Admiral said, "to implement the Orpheus Protocol." She explained to Kethmora that the humans had developed a final contingency during their long exile in the void. A weapon that could permanently destroy the rift and everything connected to it. "We can collapse the dimensional fabric in a radius of 3 light years," Tanaka-chan said, "and nothing within that space will survive because it will simply cease to exist." Kethmora felt horror spreading through her body as she understood what the Admiral was saying. "You would be erased," she whispered, "along with your entire fleet." "Not the entire fleet," Tanaka-chan corrected, "because we have held 20% of our forces in reserve, with orders to retreat to the void and continue watching over the galaxy." She smiled, and it was the saddest expression Kethmora had ever seen on any face of any species. "We always planned for this possibility," the Admiral explained, "because we knew the Queen would never stop unless we destroyed her completely." The Concord representatives who had been monitoring the battle sent desperate messages begging the humans to find another way, their voices filled with anguish at the thought of losing humanity twice. "You cannot do this," High Chancellor Vreth-san pleaded across the communication channels. "We cannot lose you again after waiting so long for your return." Admiral Tanaka-chan's response was broadcast across every frequency, so that every being in the battle could hear her words. "You do not understand," she said in a voice that carried the weight of 2,000 years of dedication. "Because we did not survive in the void because we wanted to live." She paused, and Kethmora could see tears forming in the Admiral's enhanced eyes. "We survived because we wanted to come home," Tanaka-chan continued. "But home was never a planet or a star system because Earth has been dead for longer than most of your civilizations have existed." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke the words that would become legend. "Home is wherever someone needs protecting," she declared. "And home is you, all of you. Every species and every world and every life that we swore to defend when our ancestors made their first sacrifice." The human fleet began to move forward, driving into the heart of the swarm armada with weapons blazing and shields absorbing punishment that would have vaporized any Concord vessel. "We will burn every star in this galaxy before we let the swarm take our home again," Tanaka-chan promised. "And we will tear reality itself apart if that is what it takes to keep you safe." The Prometheus Unbound led the charge toward the center of the enemy formation where the Queen's flagship waited, with its ancient intelligence focused entirely on the humans who had hurt her so badly so long ago. "Evacuate all Concord forces from the combat zone," Tanaka-chan ordered, "and tell them to remember us and to build something beautiful with the time we are giving them." Kethmora found herself being escorted to an escape pod despite her protests. And the last thing she saw before the pod launched was Admiral Tanaka-chan, standing calmly on the bridge as her ship dove toward the heart of darkness. The Orpheus Protocol activated at the exact moment the Prometheus Unbound reached the Queen's position, and reality folded in on itself in a cascade of energy that no sensor could properly record. The Queen died, screaming across 1,000,000 psychic frequencies, as everything she had built over countless millennia was erased from existence in a single impossible moment. And then there was silence. Mora floated in her escape pod and wept as she watched the space where the human fleet had been, now empty except for scattered debris and the fading glow of energies that had no name. But then her communication system activated and a message began playing that made her heart surge with hope. "This is Captain Torres of the Terran Reserve Fleet," a human voice announced, "and we are withdrawing to the void as ordered to continue our watch over the galaxy." The message continued with words that Kethmora knew would be carved into monuments across 1,000 worlds, in 1,000 years or 10,000 or 100,000. "If you need us again, then just call and we will answer, because that is what humanity does." 100 years later, Kethmora stood before the rebuilt Memorial of Soul and watched children of a dozen species playing in gardens that had been designed to honor the humans who had died to save them. She was ancient now. Her scales faded to white and her body bent with age. But her mind remained sharp enough to remember every detail of the battle that had saved the galaxy. Above the memorial, carved in stone a kilometer high, were the final words that Admiral Tanaka-chan had spoken before the cascade. Words that had become the sacred oath of the Galactic Concord. "We keep our promises." And somewhere in the void between galaxies, a fleet of human ships continued their eternal vigil, waiting patiently for the day when they would be called home once more, because that was what humanity did. They kept their promises always.